When did you first acquire an interest in dyslexia?
Well, early in my career, I actually didn't think that dyslexia existed, and it wasn't until I went to the Harvard Graduate School of Education and started to study with Jean Chall, and then became acquainted with the people who worked at the Carroll School and the people who are in the New England branch of IDA, that I began to be invited to what was then the Orton Society conferences. Alice and Sarah was a key person in persuading me that I should be involved in this organization. I was very skeptical in the beginning, and I quickly found out that the conferences that I was being invited to, first as a listener and then as a presenter, were among the most enlightening and stimulating, and I began to realize what the word dyslexia referred to, because I did not know. I began to visit the Landmark School and the Carroll School. I began to talk with teachers who used explicit, structured language teaching, and I remember very well the first sessions I went to at these conferences where these great teachers were explaining what they actually did in lessons were fascinating and thrilling, because I could see how much sense all of this made. And at the same time, as a graduate student, even though I'd been in the field for 10 years, it wasn't until I was a doctoral student that I took courses in language, and I began to see the relationship between what I was learning about the linguistic bases of reading and spelling and writing, and these methods that were being promoted by the Orton Dyslexia Society. So everything sort of came together for me in the late 1970s, early 1980s.
You mentioned Jean Chall in your graduate work at Harvard, and she is such a giant in the field. Perhaps you could tell us a little bit more about having Jean Chall as a mentor.
Well, of course, being in that department, in that program, changed my whole life. It wasn't only studying with her that was an amazing experience, but also Carol Chomsky, who was Noam Chomsky's wife, who was our teacher in the linguistics, the compulsory linguistics course, and Catherine Snow, who was a young professor who taught language development to all of us. So, and Jean Chall, to me, was always this fascinating and somewhat remote figure. I put her on a pedestal. And one day she said to me, after I'd been there for 4 years, she said, "Louisa, I think that you worry too much about everything." She said, "You're going to be okay. Just relax and get into your groove, and, you know, it's going to be okay." I remember that very clearly. And she was such a model of a scholar, and that's what has stuck with me for years.
With which schools or organizations or clinics have you been associated?
I've had a checkered career. Well, from my doctoral work on, I would say, and before that I taught in several different schools and types of schools and so on, you don't need to know about. But since leaving Harvard, I was in private practice, in a little practice in Thetford, Vermont for about 15 years. I had no affiliation other than as an adjunct clinical professor of psychiatry at Dartmouth Medical School, which meant that I went to teach the psychology interns and wasn't paid for it, but I got library privileges. That was that experience. But then I did form a relationship with the Greenwood School, and we ran a summer institute there for about 8 years. The Greenwood Institute for Teachers, where we developed these language courses for teachers. And that was the beginning of what became the LETTERS program, which I'm still supporting now, the Language Essentials for Teachers of Reading and Spelling professional development curriculum and courses. And then I did have a stint as a researcher with an affiliation with the University of Texas in Houston. I was a clinical associate professor of pediatrics, which meant that I supervised and ran an incredibly challenging project in the Washington, D.C. schools down the road from Congress for 4 years on site and another year after that. So I only went to Texas once a year for my evaluation. And then since then, I have had a really great relationship with Sopris West, the publishing company that gave me carte blanche in developing the professional development program called LETTERS and some spelling materials. I no longer have that affiliation, but that endured for 10 years.
I'm also recalling a research study that you did in Washington, D.C. with Barbara Foreman.
Yeah,
And that would have amazing results, and I remember reading about it and being very excited. Perhaps you could mention that.
Well, the study in Washington, where I was a professor at the University of Texas, but working in Washington, was under the direction of Barbara Foreman. I also got to work with Jack Fletcher and Dave Francis on that project, and several other people like Deborah Spees. The research project in Washington, D.C. was extremely challenging. We were working in low-performing schools, 98% African American, on the far side of town where the people in Georgetown never go. And what we proved was that if you teach the teachers what to do and you give them the materials and you give them some support, they are able to teach the kids, and the kids, of course, are able to learn. And the major finding of the study was that these kids who came in with all of these low scores in the beginning on every measure came out the other end of 4 years of instruction being in the middle of the average range and being able to read. We also learned that it's almost impossible to sustain a project like that without consistent leadership. So, it was kind of a reckoning with reality, but the kids can learn.
I think another thing, when I read the results of that study that impressed me so much was the fact that you found the teachers highly motivated to participate in the training because they could see it was really helping.
Yeah.
And I was very happy to read that.
Mm-hmm.
You and I both of us have a long history with IDA, and I know you've worn many hats. So I'd like to ask you about some of the positions you've held in the International Dyslexia Association, previously the Orton Society, previously the Orton Dyslexia Society.
I started on the board in 1994. I think I was appointed to replace somebody. And I remember the first committee I served on was publications. So I worked with Susan Brady to produce a monograph on teaching kids to read that was really good. I'm proud of that monograph. I don't think anyone has a copy anymore. And also at that time, I remember one of the first things that we accomplished as a board was changing the name of the organization. So it was during that, I think the first year I was on the board, with some shakers and movers like Susan Brady, that we succeeded in changing the name of the organization to IDA. I'm not sure how many years I was on the board. I think a couple of terms at that point, maybe a couple of terms plus. I think I got a short break in there somewhere. This last stint has been between 2005 and now 2012. And my major activities have been shepherding publications through particularly Perspectives. We also changed the name of the journal to Perspectives on Language and Literacy. We changed the cover design, and a lot of that work was done in collaboration with this wonderful editor who works behind the scenes, Denise Dowse, who, and Elaine Neifeld, who was working as on publications in the office to support publications. Unfortunately, she left us to work for another organization, but during that period, we accomplished a lot of change and improvements. We also decided with Perspectives that we should have we cut back, I think, from 5 issues a year to 4, and then made each one a theme issue. So my job has been to, with the committee, which has always been wonderful, to determine the current themes that we should address in the journal and find theme editors. So we have always had lively discussions about what the journal should address, and have had wonderful relationships with experts outside, within IDA and outside of IDA to generate these fabulous issues of Perspectives. And I am so happy that you and I and Moats, Joshi, were able to create our anthology last year of expert perspectives from Perspectives articles from the last 10 years. As I teach teachers, I find those articles to be among the most valuable that we can give them. So we still have a long way to go to make those articles more widely available.
Louisa, you have also been the prime mover your leadership, and provided tremendous leadership in the development of the knowledge and practice standards for the teachers of reading, which you and your committee worked on and over a period of time. They are lengthy and just enormously important to the IDA and to the outside world, so to speak, schools of education and people who are teaching teachers. Can you tell us about the process that, the behind-the-scenes process that went into developing those standards, and the endorsement process that has also started in the past year, both of which are so important to IDA?
We decided in 2009 on the board that we needed to develop the knowledge and practice standards. And where that came from was actually about, I would say about 15 years on my part of writing articles that complained about the lack of teacher knowledge, starting with one that I published with the IDA in 1994. Actually, I think that's why I was invited to be on the board in the first place. I published an article in Annals called The Missing Foundation in Teacher Education. And that led to a series of efforts on the part of a number of my colleagues, beyond what I was able to do, to document these gaps in teacher knowledge. and to demonstrate that if teachers didn't know basic content about language structure, and actually this goes back to the work of Bill Ellis. He was one of the people who inspired me, and the IDA had published articles and monographs before I ever came on the scene. And so we had documented the teachers didn't know what they needed to know. They weren't informed about structure of language. They weren't informed about research-based practice. And I decided with some other board members that if we were going to have an impact, we had to develop our own standards and articulate what it was that a teacher ought to know and be able to do. Because without that, we couldn't tackle the next problem, which would be developing assessments for teachers that were meaningful and related to the ability to teach kids. And also, without this reference point, we wouldn't be able to evaluate and or develop professional development materials and courses. The frameworks that exist in a set of standards guide a whole chain reaction of things downstream. And finally, I figured that out. You know, I was pretty slow to figure that out. So in 2009, literally after 15 years of just kind of treading water and getting up at conferences and saying, these surveys show that teachers don't know things, I assembled a wonderful committee. Louisa Spear-Swirling was on it. There was a representative from the OG group. There was a representative from ALTA, from IMSLEC, and Louise was a university professor. So we worked, I think, over a period of maybe 6 months. And I did a lot of the drafting, but I had a lot of input, particularly from Louisa Spear-Swirling, who's responsible for writing a lot of the introductory blurbs and contributing to the reference list that support the efficacy of each of the standards. Barbara Wilson had a hand in it. Rosalie Davis, I'm forgetting somebody important. I think Nancy, Suzanne Carricker, definitely. So we had a wonderful committee. And the thrilling thing about the development was the consensus that we all readily demonstrated, in spite of the fact that some of the participating, the representatives of the various groups were not always, I would say, actively collaborating with one another. This was an activity in which I felt we really collaborated and found the common ground, the common language, the common set of expectations, and the common knowledge base that binds us all together for this greater purpose. Because our commonalities, as it turns out, are much greater than our differences, and sometimes our differences, to me, are dismaying. And I'd like to say on the videotape that I just so sincerely hope that all of us, in spite of whatever differences we have about methodologies, can always keep in mind the greater purpose that IDA represents. It's just so important, because fragmentation really diminishes our power to affect change and really have ourselves be heard out there. Our common interests are so much greater than our individual, more selfish, self-serving interests. And I just so hope that everybody can always keep that larger agenda in mind. But what we've been able to do with the standards is so pleasing to me, and I just so grateful to Liz Liptak, who's now full-time staff member, and all of the reviewers. We got 40 people to be involved in reviews of university programs. We actively sought participation from university programs, invited those that thought they were aligned with our standards to volunteer to be reviewed by an independent committee of qualified reviewers who had to work as a team and resolve their differences. This is similar to any review process that goes on with grants or with accreditation or anything else. So we got this going a year ago, and I couldn't be more pleased that today at the conference, in this morning's session, those slides were up there for all to see, identifying the programs that were recognized by IDA as being aligned with the standards. For me, this is even beyond perspectives as the most gratifying achievement of our organization. I am just so pleased. It's so concrete. It is so positive. It is so such a firm step toward our future goals of injecting these standards into the discussions that go on in university programs, and also injecting them into the world of professional development. Even though we only have 9 programs in this first step, there are others coming forward now who are requesting a review, which is great. And even, this is less visible, but I think even more of an influence of the standards. Those standards are out there on the desks of all the deans of education in schools of education. Those standards have made it to the desks of thousands of reading professors. Those standards are being discussed. They're being used as a reference point. Even if we don't document that specifically, we know it's going on because of all the feedback that comes back to me and other board members and members of the committees that have worked on these reviews. So we are finally really getting somewhere, and then so what's the payoff? It's not just recognition. It's the real payoff is that those programs are getting more applicants from teachers who recognize the value of these standards and who wish to be certified by a program that meets our standards. So this is really good.
I have to say thank you, and for your leadership, your commitment. It has been sustained for such a long period of time to the benefit of IDA, but also to the benefit of all those educators, administrators, university professors who are trying to teach children to read, and you have so supported the mission of the IDA over a long period of time. Just thank you so much.
And I'm most grateful to the IDA. One thing I didn't say before is that I really got my education through the IDA. I know I have a doctorate from Harvard, but I have to say that my real education has been going to IDA meetings year after year and hearing the greatest researchers present their research. I remember in 1982, I think, meeting Isabel Liberman and Alvin Liberman, but meeting Isabel Liberman at a conference, and I felt as if I needed to kiss the feet of God. I almost did. But she had a conversation with me after her presentation, which struck me as the most enlightening talk that I had heard. Even though I've been at the Ed School for 5 years, hearing Isabel Liberman for an hour and a half trace the relationship between speech and print processing so clearly, with such support from research, and to tie that to instruction that made a difference for kids was so powerful. But that was just one experience of just, many, many over the years. When you get to be an Orton Oak, as I am, I'm sure there are many people who would agree with me that we've been so privileged because of the work of the IDA to hear all the major contributors to our field. All we have to do is show up at the national meeting or regional meetings, and we get to meet all the people who write the major articles and advance our thinking. It's just such a privilege and so important for all of us.
life.